Here on Origins, we love shooters as much as the next gamer, and on today's episode we're exploring a title from the niche subgenre of the all-guns-blazing format, the loot shooter. One of the newest entries into the gun-orientated domain of gaming, the loot shooter has seen rapid growth in recent years. The combination of narrative-powered role-playing merged with action-packed first-person shooter firing has led to games like Destiny and Tom Clancy's The Division proving exceptionally popular in this field. There is still one other title whose name is synonymous with the genre, and in truth, was the first majorly successful franchise that got loot shooters going in the first place, with its eye-catching graphics and seemingly endless variations of weaponry. Cock those shotguns, clean that sniper scope, and assemble your team of Vault Hunters in readiness for the story of Borderlands. For a game that saw its first entry appear in 2009, we're going to have to go back to April 1971 to kickstart this story, with the birth of later-to-be Borderlands creator, Randy Pitchford. Randy was destined to work in technology from a young age, growing up under the same roof as a US intelligence agent. This wasn't some man in a black suit and sunglasses, and to Randy, he was simply Dad. His father was a pioneer in creating gadgets and computers that simply didn't exist yet, and his dedication to creating the uncreated soon rubbed off on Randy. His dad would bring back bits and pieces of his work every day, which fed Randy's curiosity, and for his 7th birthday, Randy was gifted his own computer, hand-built by his father. Young Randy was in awe of the seemingly futuristic machine and wanted to experience everything it could do. Naturally, computer games were the first port of call, but Randy had an insatiable appetite, like his father, for wanting to know how things worked. He used a hex editor, which is software that broke down a game's code, to learn about his favorite titles and uncover how they were programmed. This was the beginning of his journey, and a few years later, aged just 12 years old, he finished his first video game. From here, it was inevitable that Randy would follow this path, and come his late teenage years, he was at the University of California, studying a form of computer science. It's no secret though that university fees are rather on the expensive side, and most students worked a job to help subsidize their education. Randy was no different in this respect, but instead of pouring pints or waiting tables, he had a different skill that he used to make money. One thing we might have forgotten to mention is that Randy's uncle was a famous magician, known on stage as the Great Cardini. He passed when Randy was only 2 years old, but the flair for magic was, apparently, genetic, and Randy had picked up more than a card trick or two. So now at university, in his spare time, Randy would perform magic shows for large crowds of people, working his way up from the streets to performing at the renowned Magic Castle in Los Angeles. However, his performances of illusion did more than just pay for his classes. It made Randy realize that entertaining vast audiences was his calling. He enjoyed holding back the mystery of his stunts, and recognized the greatest enjoyment from the crowd occurred when they got a surprise from his show that they simply weren't expecting. Like every student though, his time at university came to an end, and after graduating, secured a job at the creators of the soon-to-be infamous Duke Nukem series, 3D Realms. Randy joined the company in time to become a major component on the franchise's most popular title, Duke Nukem 3D. Just over a year after Duke Nukem 3D had met its audience, Randy and a few other developers at 3D Realms left the company. Randy and his fellow developers decided a fresh start was in order and joined an unknown studio, Rebel Boat Rocker. He helped with work on the company's first title, a first-person shooter called Prax War, which had received funding and a publishing agreement from EA. But close to the game's completion, the publishing giants got cold feet and pulled out of their agreement. Without the means to continue on their own, Rebel Boat Rocker folded without releasing a single game in their brief 2-year lifespan. Randy wasn't going to be put off that easily though, and rather than start at the bottom once again, the part-time magician decided it was time to conjure up his own company. Alongside 4 other developers from Rebel Boat Rocker, Randy founded Gearbox Software in February 1999. He was stern on the company's direction, instructing his colleagues that they wouldn't make the same mistakes as last time. Randy wanted to build up their reputation by working alongside big names in the industry, and approached video game frontrunners Valve, who agreed to let them help design and produce expansion packs for Half-Life. Their maiden project was met with abundant praise from critics and fans alike, with rave reviews flooding in. It was a great start for the company, and soon, more work began to follow. Gearbox were given many opportunities to expand their portfolio, and produced ports for AAA titles including Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and Halo Combat Evolved. The Gearbox boat was chugging along smoothly, turning a decent profit and forging relationships with major companies like Activision and Valve. But Randy and the Gearbox crew yearned for two things that they hadn't been able to properly achieve as of yet. The first was their desire for more first-person shooters, which had sort of been accomplished with their work on Half-Life, Halo, and James Bond. The second, and more resounding ambition, was that they wanted their own games, and their own franchises. It was 2005, and the company had been doing dirty work for nearly 6 years. It was unarguable that work for hire was paying the bills, but if they were ever going to make their own games, now was the time. Released for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2, Brothers in Arms Road to Hill 30 became Gearbox's first solo entry to the video gaming world. The historical Second World War shooter was a strong debut franchise for Gearbox, yet their ambitions were growing, and they wanted to plant themselves firmly in the FPS landscape. By 2007, Gearbox had established themselves as a go-to developer for first-person shooter games. With this in mind, Randy believed that now was the time for them to really make a name for themselves and think massively outside the box. Gearbox enjoyed their Brothers in Arms games, but felt like the title was a little restricted, and wanted a game with more reward, larger maps, and crucially, more guns. Randy put forward the idea of incorporating a secondary genre within their specialist format of first-person shooting, and after a few ideas had been thrown about, the team settled on a role-playing game. RPGs often had larger expanses for players to roam, and offered a lengthier time or additional factors which aided in replayability. Titles in the genre were very much about completing the campaign and moving on, with only a select few offering multiplayer capabilities. Randy was a big fan of the RPG mechanics that enabled players to level up and customize their characters, and was eager for Gearbox to do the same to the shooter genre. He pitched the idea of a game that blended together elements from Halo, Diablo, and the post-apocalyptic franchise Mad Max. Soon, a dystopian, desert-style alien planet began to form. Gearbox began developing their main characters, a ragtag team of 4 unique classes with distinguishing abilities that could be further enhanced as they battled across the unforgiving alien landscape that was now named Pandora. Aside from their unique abilities, our Vault Hunters, Brick, Lilith, Mordecai, and Roland each had a weapon class that they were particularly skilled in using. Mordecai, for instance, utilized abilities that allowed him to achieve devastating accuracy with sniper rifles. It was early 2009, and the game was progressing at a rapid rate, with the gameplay falling into place and hyper-realistic graphics taking the title to another level. As development neared completion, however, a number of new first-person shooters hit the market, also featuring some near-to-life graphics. Games like Rage and Fallout 3 were being compared to one another, and Gearbox feared they'd be drawn into this battle of who copied whom. Their desert setting also didn't help matters, looking very brown and dull in comparison to their competitors. Releasing their game now wouldn't offer as groundbreaking an experience as they'd hoped, but with development now 3 years in, it was a tough decision to go back on their work. One of the 5 original co-founders of Gearbox Software, Brian Martell, was the chief creative officer at the company and lead artist on the game. Behind the scenes, he began working on a concept called cell shading, a combination of hand-drawn textures and heavily outlined features that took away from the hyper-realistic graphics and presented some very eye-catching comic book-style artwork. Revealing this to Randy and the rest of the dev team, they agreed it was unique, bold, and would surely catch the eye of any curious gamer. They made the decision to switch up their graphic style to Brian's new concept when the game was already over 3/4 of the way finished, putting themselves in a position where they began to run low on money and time. Randy had announced a 4th quarter release date for 2009, and he didn't want Gearbox becoming a company that couldn't be trusted.
I think that the art direction actually didn't serve us at the beginning with getting attention. The art direction that we landed on got everyone's attention. And that was really kind of interesting, that change. That a lot of folks in the industry approach me and you guys are dumb, that's a huge risk, you're gonna totally eat it. And I was like, I don't think so. I think that's actually gonna help people notice something that's great anyway.
To speed up development, they incorporated technology and code from some of their Brothers in Arms games, and come October 2009, the game was ready for release on the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC, and was now titled Borderlands. The game was a pioneer in the industry, giving longevity to a title in the shooter genre, with many aspects to the game for players to explore. Alongside this, their decision to disregard hyper-realistic graphics in favor of cel shading proved a masterstroke, with their graphics never going out of fashion despite new technology appearing. Yet one element of the game was more significant than any other, and that was quite simply the sheer number of guns that Gearbox had loaded into their audacious title. The figure was staggering, and many people almost didn't believe Gearbox when they announced their game would have, drumroll please, 16 million guns. Yes, that's right, 16 million guns to collect and try out until players had found the combination that worked perfectly for their style of gaming. The game hit shelves with a fantastic response from both the press and customers. A month after the game went live, Gearbox dropped their first DLC pack, The Zombie Island of Dr. Ned, featuring new areas to explore, quests to complete, and of course, even more guns to try out. This was only the beginning though. By the end of the year, the game had sold over 2 million copies, and just 2 months into 2010, 2 more DLCs had been released, making sales soar to 3 million with the constant introduction of new content. This was it, Gearbox's first major hit. But in Randy's mind, this was only the opening act of what was still to come. Randy Pitchford had successfully led Gearbox Software through their first few years in the game's development world, feeding his team's hunger for first-person shooters. Their third-party work gave them a springboard to release their first franchise, Brothers in Arms, but the team wanted to go further. After merging the FPS and RPG genres together in Borderlands, Gearbox created a loot shooter for the masses that people could keep coming back to. The part-time magician had conjured up a major franchise and a new genre, seemingly from thin air, and was ready to get the ball rolling with a second title for the series. With the major success of Borderlands and its accompanying DLCs, it was inevitable that a sequel would follow. Gearbox had planned for this eventuality and assumed the first game would give them a budget of around $10 million to work with. Well, that was based on sales projections before the game had headed to market, and now, 6 months later, Gearbox had over 3 times that amount to produce the next title in the series. At their core, Gearbox were a fan-focused company and wanted to reinvest everything from their fans back into their games. They put the money to good use, working on new soundtracks and refining their graphics, maintaining the middle ground between realism and stylized visuals, which had captured such a wide audience. The team also went big on environments. The first game, whilst a huge success, limited players to just the deserts of Pandora, and Gearbox were keen to explore the rest of the planet. Under the guidance of new art director Jeremy Cook, they developed vast and complex settings ranging from vast glaciers to volcanic environments. This gave players a greater variety of biomes to explore, but crucially, also injected some much-needed color into the planet.
Interestingly, when we designed the first game, we actually had a map of Pandora that had all these grasslands, that had frozen wastelands to the north, and we just decided, okay, well, we need to go out and explore the rest of Pandora.
Still wanting to live up to their fans' expectations, Gearbox put out a public survey in 2011, asking players what aspects they wanted to improve, and acted to incorporate the most popular suggestions into their sequel. They wanted greater density within Pandora's environments, so Gearbox obliged, filling them with more objects, buildings, and characters that could all be interacted with. One of the biggest requests from fans was for a push on collaboration and multiplayer aspects. With squads of the whole Vault Hunter quartet, it was difficult to move across a map quickly together. Gearbox heard these requests and provided several remedies. They introduced vehicles that could carry teams of 4 and debuted a weapon sharing system so players could try out each other's loot. There was still one more major change to make to the game, one that came from the primary negative point that critics had mentioned about the first title. Its narrative, quite frankly, paled in comparison to the rest of it. For Borderlands 2, the team greatly minimized the amount of cutscenes, focusing on more environmental storytelling and having characters interact with each other to maintain the momentum of the story. For this, they introduced more non-playable characters, including the lively and explosive Tiny Tina, who helped guide the Vault Hunters and narrate parts of the story.
Just stick to the fundamentals I taught you and you're gonna be ace.
Gearbox also based the game 5 years after the original, and gave their new gang of Vault Hunters a clear enemy, Handsome Jack.
Lilith, kill the Vault Hunter. We've got a date to keep with the warrior.
Handsome Jack was a welcome addition to the series, with a deep background of childhood trauma leading to his self-proclaimed dictatorship over Pandora. Along with this multifaceted and complicated antagonist came some intricately positioned deaths and emotional beats in a script 6 times longer than the original Borderlands. 2 months into its lifespan, and the game had sold over 5 million copies, nearly surpassing the first title's entire sales history in a matter of weeks. Gearbox had prepared yet more DLCs featuring new campaigns, characters, and a whole host of other features, which were released over the next 2 years. By the time the 9th DLC pack went live in 2014, the game had sold over 8.5 million copies, making it not just Gearbox, but 2K's best-selling game ever. The bond between the companies was as strong as any you'd find in the modern gaming era, and they took this period of commercial success to make a new major announcement for the franchise: Borderlands the pre-sequel and Tales from Borderlands. Borderlands had grown into one of gaming's biggest franchises after just 2 games. Yet strangely, Gearbox wanted to take some time off and try and grow some of their other titles. Since 2008, the company had only released 2 games in the Brothers in Arms series, considerably less than the 9 they'd created in the franchise's first 3 years. Not wanting to completely drop Borderlands from their plans, they outsourced the next installment in the series to 2K Australia. At the same time, California-based developers Telltale Games had come to Gearbox with an idea to develop the Borderlands universe with a different angle on the franchise and tell new stories in a unique way. Telltale were experts in episodic games, working on titles like The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us. They wanted to give Borderlands the same treatment. Back with 2K Australia, Randy believed it was time for the story to move away from the single planet of Pandora. Borderlands 2 had alluded to a base on the moon orbiting Pandora, but was never actually visited or made playable. Set between both of the first 2 Borderlands titles, Borderlands the pre-sequel made Handsome Jack's crew playable characters, gifting brand new abilities and storylines for players as they explored Pandora's moon of Elpis during their missions. The title had an added bit of comedy to it, with the moon inhabitants inheriting the Australian accents of its creators.
You okay? Well, I can answer that. You're not okay. The second you open this door, all the oxygen is going to vent and you're going to suffocate.
2K had used the same game engine from Borderlands 2, and as such, when the game had gone gold, it wasn't available for the new generation of consoles, namely the Xbox One and PS4. The developers were convinced that by releasing the game on the same platform as the first 2 titles, more fans would be reached. However, following the game's release in October 2014, the game had to be re-released just 5 months later, specifically for the Xbox One and PS4, under the newly rebranded title of Borderlands the Handsome Collection. This contained both the pre-sequel and Borderlands 2. The marketing had gone drastically wrong for 2K, and now that the game had been bundled with the second title, players didn't see their game as a standalone installment, instead viewing it as a larger-than-normal expansion pack. To add to the confusion, Telltale Games' 5-part episodic series, Tales from the Borderlands, began to release at pretty much the same time, and episodes rolled out every few months. Borderlands was shoving narratives down the throats of their fans, who were struggling to keep up with everything that was being thrown at them. While an emphasis on storyline had been met on both games, the actual gameplay was severely lacking in comparison to what players were used to following Borderlands 2. It wasn't what 2K Australia had hoped for, and their aims of doing a Gearbox and launching their own franchise off the back of expansion pack work were about to fall through. Partway through 2015, their offices shut down, with focus switching fully to the company's American division. Gearbox's experiment to take a breather hadn't worked out. Between the narrative, gameplay, and marketing strategy, Borderlands had lost its identity. But now the original creators were ready to take the franchise back into their own hands. By the time the Handsome Collection was released, Gearbox's second title in the franchise had surpassed 12 million copies sold. partly due to its addictive nature, but mainly down to Gearbox's constant updates and DLC releases that continuously provided players with brand new content. The game was still recording over 1 million active players every month, and Gearbox were only too happy to give them more quests to take on and more guns to try out. The 2019 DLC release was more than a routine content drop. It was the final one for the game, and incorporated a lot of the new characters that had been introduced in Tales from the Borderlands. It filled in several plot holes in the story, but crucially acted as the bridge between Borderlands 2 and the franchise's next direct sequel, Borderlands 3. The game had been in development for nearly 3 years, after Gearbox had realised the capabilities of the powerful modern consoles, and how much they'd left themselves limited by not instructing 2K to target these with the pre-sequel game. With this new knowledge, and some brand new offices opening in Quebec, Gearbox was sure this would be the ideal maiden voyage for their swanky new setup, and Borderlands 3 became the biggest project the company had ever produced. Where else could they start though, besides the number of guns that would be available in the game? Let's take a recap and remember that Borderlands 2 had nearly 18 million guns available. Borderlands 3 was ready to make this look like some serious rookie numbers, with Gearbox quoting the game had, quite literally, over 1 billion guns in it. Yes, don't worry, you heard me right. 1 billion guns. It was the ultimate upgrade after fans had sat through 2 titles of reduced gameplay, and this was only the beginning. Randy had encouraged 2K to take the story of Borderlands away from Pandora. For Randy though, he could now dream bigger, and the team of Vault Hunters could now go out and explore the galaxy on planets far and away from Pandora. New worlds, a titanic amount of guns, and, oh, a lot more characters too, were just some of the reasons why only 5 days after the game was released in September 2019, it had sold over 5 million copies. By the end of the year, this number had risen to 8 million, and Borderlands 3 had successfully reset the franchise back onto the right path. Strangely, even though the game was another phenomenal commercial mega hit, critics weren't wowed, saying that gameplay-wise, it was just like the first 2 games. But maybe this was the secret. Attempts to differ from these had been poorly received, and the sales figures spoke for themselves. Borderlands was back in the big time, and Gearbox were wholly responsible for its return to the top of the sales charts and to their fans' hearts. Starting out with little more than a love for FPS gaming, Randy Pitchford played the ultimate game in patience, building up his company's reputation before tackling their own games. Borderlands is probably the first title gamers think about when someone mentions loot shooters, and why not? Gearbox practically launched the genre by themselves. And whether or not we see a Borderlands 4 anytime soon is anyone's guess. Although Randy has certainly done his fair share of teasing. I guess we'll have to wait and see what this magician pulls out of his hat next. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next Origins.